Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dulce Roman, and I'm Chief Curator and Curator of Modern Art here at the Harn Museum of Art. I would like to welcome you to this afternoon's program, a panel discussion titled Cuba's Social and Cultural Life. This program is on the occasion of our new exhibition, The Art of Pedro Pablo Oliva, which is on view in the Harn Grandchildren Foyer through July 7th. I co-curated the exhibition along with Dr. Lillian Guerra, Professor of History at the University of Florida. And Dr. Guerra is also one of our panelists, so we'll be hearing from her very soon. This panel is presented in partnership with Bulla Cubana, which is a month-long citywide celebration of arts and culture, promoting the exchange of ideas and inspiration between Cuba and the North Central Florida region. A book signing with artist Pedro Pablo Oliva will follow in the museum's lobby area. We ask that everyone exit through the auditorium promptly following the question and answer period so that we can start the book signing and continue the conversations in the lobby. And we are really honored that the artist Pedro Pablo Oliva is here today with us in the audience. And now I would like to introduce to you our esteemed speakers who are seated up at the front of the auditorium. David Orca is our first speaker today, and he is a Cuban independent art curator and film producer. He has worked as director of La Gaveta, magazine on arts and literature of the Hermanos Saiz Young Artists Association in Pinar del Rio, Cuba. He's also curator and chief arts project developer for the Casa Taller Pedro Pablo Oliva Cultural Foundation. He has lectured extensively and has written articles on visual arts, performing arts, and cinema for several publications in Cuba and abroad. Orca is currently a freelance art projects developer and investigator, independent consultant for Florida-based foundation, the Cuban Arts Group, and associate curator of Pedro Pablo Oliva's art studios. Our next panelist is Professor Lillian Guerra. She's author of many scholarly articles and essays, 3 collections of Spanish language poetry, a book of short stories, and 4 published books of history, 3 of them on 20th century Cuba. Her book, Visions of Power in Cuba, Revolution, Redemption, and Resistance, 1959 to 1971, published by University of North Carolina Press, 2012, received the 2014 Bryce Wood Book Award from the Latin American Studies Association, its most prestigious prize for a book on Latin America across all fields. Dr. Guerra's 4th book, published by Yale University Press in 2018, is titled Heroes, Martyrs, and Political Messiahs in Revolutionary Cuba, 1946 to 1958. In 2014 to 2015, she received a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship, an American Council of Learning Societies Fellowship, and in 2017, an Emmy Award for the documentary film, The Forgotten Revolution, now available on Netflix. Our 3rd panelist is Raul Villarreal. He is a visual artist, an author, educator, and the coordinator for cultural programs at Santa Fe College. He has exhibited his work in 21 person exhibits and over 400 group exhibits in the United States and abroad. He co-wrote and co-produced and narrated the short documentary, Hemingway Between Key West and Cuba, in 2018, and co-authored Hemingway's Cuban Son, published in 2009 by Kent State University Press. He is also co-founder of the Neo-Latino Artists Collective. And our 4th panelist is Daniel Fernandez Guevara. He is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Florida. His dissertation, Weaponizing Solidarity, Spanish Republican Exiles, Identity, and the Cuban Revolution, 1929 to 1976, examines the impact of Spanish Republican exiles on the Cuban Revolution. Daniel's forthcoming article, titled Constructing Legitimacy in Stone and Words During Cuba's Second Republic, Building and Contesting Fulgencio Batista's José Martí, will appear in History and Memory in September 2019. So thank you to our esteemed panelists, and we look forward to hearing their conversation.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thanks for this wonderful opportunity to share with you. Being appointed as specialist in Pedro Pablo Oliva's work is a huge honor, and is also a huge responsibility when we're talking about an artist that has been around for more than half a century, and is one of the most outstanding living Cuban artists right now. And the approach to his work, from what has been presented in this panel, Cuban social and cultural life, is also a huge responsibility, because probably the biggest dimension in many aspects of the work of a multidimensional artist is precisely his approach, his representation, his discussion about Cuban reality, Cuban society from his work. But he was very well known for his lush ars erotica, for his reference to childhood memories, reminiscences, for his realistic imagery, for the influence of comic strips, caricature, illustration in his work, for being playful, for being whimsical, for being, dreamlike. But for Cubans, at least, for us who live in Cuba, there's this other dimension, which is probably less known for most people, especially non-Cubans, which is the dimension of the artist who is socially aware, who is constantly trying to grasp the spiritual ambience, the psychological atmosphere, the state of mind of Cubans. All sorts of tribulations, of events that shape and reshape their lives once and again. And this is what I'm going to be talking about today. I have little time, so what I did is I chose one particular piece made in the 90s that probably reflects like no other one before and so far after it. This political, social dimension of Pedro Pablo Oliva I'm talking about. It's on the screen. I'm going to ask you to let me just stand up, because I'm going to refer to some specific elements in this piece that I need to actually see. The title is The Great Blackout. It was made in 1994. Just for reference, 1994 was the peak of the economic crisis, economic, political, social, spiritual crisis of the 1990s in Cuba after the collapse of socialism in Eastern Europe. The work comes from a series titled Shelters. The title of the series itself is singular. I will start pointing some elements in the painting that will make you understand what this is all about. The title refers of the series of which this work belongs. It refers to something that actually happened in the 90s. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, Cuban leaders started talking constantly, all the time, about the imminence of a military invasion. We were the ripe fruit. We were no longer under the political, economic, and military protectorate of the Soviet Union and the socialist countries. So we were ready to be taken by you guys. So in the rhetoric of Cuban politicians was this paranoia, this idea that we were finally the ripe fruit. So in the whole country, there was a program posted by the Cuban government where in every school, working center, neighborhood, wherever you go, people started opening small galleries on the ground to build improvised community shelters to protect people from this supposed to come air rays from the USAF. Oliva, who has this particular way of looking at reality, which is traversed by irony and satire and absurd, started wondering himself, if you're going to live underground, how is it going to be? So he started this series in which the key element are these horizontal bands below and above, which represent a singular perspective of an underground shelter, like a bunker underground, as a cross-section of it, as if you, as a privileged viewer, could see what is going on inside. He painted all sorts of events inside those imaginary shelters. Carnivals, parades, a king in his garden, orgies, you name it. This was the last one, finished in 1994. And the title, The Great Blackout, refers to something that also happened to us Cubans in those times. It was a blackout, not only because it was real. I mean, we were suffering from very long blackouts, power cuts that lasted for 8, 12 hours. You couldn't even see your own hands in the middle of the night. So there was darkness everywhere because of shortage of fuel, of energy. All our links to our providers were cut overnight. But it also refers to something else, a different kind of blackness, a different kind of darkness. And it is, I'm going to explain you this, in a different way. Imagine that for yourself, throughout your life, the world is very simple, it's very easy to understand. There's no way you can lose track, you can get lost. It's safe and sound. You feel secure, comfortable in it. It's as easy as to understand that there is East and West, socialism and capitalism, good and evil. That's it. You just have to choose sides. And then all of a sudden, with the falling of the Berlin Wall, with the collapse of socialism, all these certainties went down with it. We were not sure of anything else anymore. There was all uncertainty. If this was not true, what is true? If this is not the way, which way? If this was not as solid as it seemed, what is solid anymore? Everything solid vanishes in the air. So the Great Blackout, in its own way, midway between tragedy and comedy, satire, absurd, surreal, is Oliva's personal vision of those times. Times of confusion, frustration, impotence, where we couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. It represents, let's say metaphorically, Cuba, on the ground, isolated in its own shell, fearing the outside, in the middle of a blackout. Now imagine the situation, which is represented here. All those people, I wish I had a pointer right now, all those people with candlelights trying to look through darkness, their eyes popping out of their sockets, trying so hard to look through darkness, that confusion, all cramped, all jammed inside the shelter. And there are so many elements in this painting that refer to those times, which in a way reflect the idea which he has himself embraced as a kind of identity, that he's a chronicler of his times. That his paintings are visual documentaries, chronicles of what actually happens. They are like a mixture, like a palimpsest, like stories, different stories weaved together into one story of both his personal life but also his social life. There you have it all. The migratory crisis, the Maleconazo, the migratory crisis of August 4, 1994, where thousands of Cubans went into this crazy adventure of getting whatever they could reach within they could have within reach of their hands to build improvised rafts and cross the shark-infested, hurricane-stricken Florida Straits toward the American dream, whatever that is. Many of them lost their lives, drowned in the straits, eaten by sharks, dehydrated, you name it. There are no official statistics. There it is. out of the many aspects that were controversial when this painting came out, there are a few elements that are not only anecdotal, but they have a very strong symbolical meaning. And this was probably one of them. These two. Here you have for the first time, not in Oliva's work, who had dealt with the image of Fidel Castro himself in his work since the late 80s. And it was one of the very few Cuban artists that actually portrayed the likeness of Fidel just like it is. What was controversial about it is that this represents a podium, right? With the microphones and the Cuban flag, the only place in the painting where there is a vertical light falling, like, you know, in those paintings in the vaults of cathedral, the image of the Holy Spirit shedding light from a pigeon, only it doesn't come from a pigeon. It comes from a quinqué, a kerosene lamp, a domestic Cuban kerosene lamp, which we used in our homes at night, trying to see through darkness. But then, what was actually controversial is the fact that the podium is empty. How come? If he's a chronicler of our times, it contradicts every single thing that was actually happening with respect to the podiums. You know, the place where there is a leader. The podium in every single culture, modern culture, means the one who knows, the one who leads, the one who sees beyond. But then it is empty in the moment where Cuban political leaders spoke more than ever before. Fidel Castro, I think well, for a time, and I'm not sure if it's still true, he holds the Guinness record for the longest public speech ever. 7 hours long, on public television. But you know what? There was no other way, you know? There's only words. And I have to finish in pretty short time. And so that empty podium, the fact that Fidel was not at the podium, at the moment where they spoke more than ever, this fallen angel, whatever it means, what? Icarus falling? The idea of socialism and creating a new man? We reached so close to the sun that the winds melted and we fell down? Is that the fallen angel of socialism? Many of these elements point to the method of Oliva at the time of portraying Cuban reality, symbolically speaking, but also through anecdotes, showing us what there is, without taking any kind of, you know, position in front of it, because it's a documentary. It is a mirror image of ourselves. So I just wanted to point out all these elements. Actually, this is a very small image. You know, this is like 6 meters wide and 3.60 meters tall. It's a huge, huge mural painting. He devoted more than a year focused on it. And there you can see, you know, all his energy, mental and physical energy, put into it. So I will leave you to the other colleagues, which will further his approach to his work and Cuban social and cultural reality.
So, buenas tardes. I get to be the cop of the time, and now I have to police myself. So, first, it is an extraordinary honor to be here. I met Pedro Pablo Oliva for the first time in 2003 and have been a fanatical follower of his work since I went to Cuba in 1995 for the first time. And then in 1996, I stayed for an entire year without leaving and really became steeped in the artistic community there. And what I find to be extraordinary about Pedro Pablo's contributions is that there is not just a palimpsest and a chronicle, but as a historian, and I actually believe that most Cubans, especially those who live on the island, are historians. They're not memoirists. They actually have to live the history that is often not published. It's the unofficial history of the revolution. But as a historian, I see a very precise archive and a very precise analysis of what it meant to be Cuban in a context in which Cubans were never supposed to just be human. They were supposed to be superhumans. They were supposed in the 1960s to overcome all that Cuba had suffered in the past, which meant imperialism, it meant capitalism, it meant that one had to be, as Che Guevara and Fidel Castro argued, a new man. And if you're a woman, that was even harder. And to be the new man meant to be selfless, it meant to be altruistic, it meant to be, by the 1970s, perfect. So the goal in the 1970s, as announced by Fidel Castro and the Ministry of Education in 1973, was perfeccionismo. You had to be a perfect person. So the weight of this reality of having to be superhuman collapses and dissolves in this other reality, which I see as the consciousness of Cubans, that Pedro Pablo opens up to us with this window onto this consciousness. So I wanted to use this image because 1991 is a moment when it is made, it is a moment in which context matters a great deal. In 1991, not only did we have the collapse of the Soviet Union, but we had the denial in Cuba, official denial by Fidel Castro that this was a political crisis or an ideological one. Officially, it was only an economic crisis that Cubans had to contend with. And so discussing the incredible shift in consciousness that happened was something that was not supposed to take place. And yet it was taking place in every mind, in every family, in every school, in every hallway, in every classroom, in the public. And so, to be more precise, I want to talk about first the other references that are in this painting. So it's called Saturno, which means Saturn. And there are two. If you're a good art historian, you would see immediately. One is that there is the Greco-Roman myth of Saturn. And Saturn, of course, is a god who gets a prophecy, receives a prophecy that he will be overthrown by his children. And so upon the birth of every one of the children, he eats them. And then there is another reference, which is to Francisco Goya's spectacular painting called Devorando su hijo, Saturno devorando su hijo, or Saturn devouring his son, which Francisco Goya painted, it's one of 14 paintings that he painted on the wall of his house, one of the walls of his house. And so these two things come together here, and then they're Cubanized. But the context in which Francisco Goya paints this painting is one of the early 1820s, when Spain has not just created a second Inquisition to try Christians who are at that point 8 or 9 generations removed from Judaism for still supposedly having some kind of fidelity to the Jewish faith. But it's a time when the King of Spain has denied the colonies the right to be self-ruling states. And so that all of that is important to the title of this painting. And then the ways, in spectacular ways, in which Pedro Pablo roots Saturn playing with his children, which is the title of Pedro Pablo's work, in that moment of Cuba and in the larger landscape of the revolution. So it's not hard to see once you start looking at it. First we have the fact that it's a circus. And under the big tent, you have a Fidel who is actually wearing a mask of Fidel, and that person who's wearing a mask of Fidel is apparently another person. So you have a mask, you have a Fidel that's masked more than once. His teeth are the very famous fingers of Fidel that when you get bored because you're standing in a 1 million-person audience at a state-organized rally, you start noticing, you start looking at the fingers. And if you're on TV, you're watching, or you're sitting in front of TV, you're watching his fingers. You're also watching microphones. But here his fingers are teeth. And his children reflect a diversity of beings. You have the most significant being a wind-up toy who's about to be devoured. And on his head rests the evidence of his original sin, the apple stolen from the tree of knowledge. The term original sin for Cubans who grew up in the 60s and 70s is significant because you heard all about it, you read all about it every time you read Che Guevara's essay on the new man, in which he writes about how Cubans born and raised before 1959 were going to be guilty of an original sin because they had grown up in bourgeois capitalism and they had the stain. And so Che said, the new generations born into the revolution would be different, and they would eliminate this original sin. They were born without it. But the problem, as we see in the painting, is that effectively, decades later, in fact every decade, you have a new generation of young revolutionaries, all of whom believe that they will one day take power. They will one day replace the father. And that never happened. It never happened. Instead, Saturn would eat his children. And so, let me check the time. And so then there's many other things that are in this painting. The fact that the masked Fidel is a jack-in-the-box is not insignificant. And inside the jack-in-the-box, if you look in the box, is apparently Cuba Libre, who's always depicted as a female image, marrying Jose Marti. You see as well that there are sideshows, and in the sideshows you have images that, if we were to be really specific, reference a lot of political cartoons made by La Juventud Comunista in the 1960s. There was a particular phrase that was used by young people to criticize those who were ardent revolutionaries and were required to police the other revolutionaries, and they called them manco mentales. So there would be a handless brain, is that kind of idea. Manco is somebody who doesn't have arms. But here you have, people who have arms that are microphones. You have a man with a double head. You have the man to my right, who's got the arms for microphones, is also a podium. His body is a podium. His hands have become microphones. And so this incredible array of the children of the revolution, in fact, represent a lot of the many, many experiences that Cubans lived, especially those who were loyal, because one of the great ironies of this process is that performing loyalty was often more important than loyalty itself. If you are capable of performing loyalty for the audience of fellow Cubans, and more importantly for one audience, which was often the party or the autocrat who might be standing before you and who represented the party, that performance mattered more than what you actually felt or what you actually believed and what you actually wanted to do. And so this idea that everybody was subject to being inside a giant tent, and that was the experience of generations, comes together in this fabulous painting. So there are other contexts that matter too. 1991, aside from being a moment for Cubans which placed it on the verge of the collapse of the Soviet Union and what would that mean, we also have a reference to the fact that there had just recently been an inquisition in Cuba. In 1989, the Cuban government subjected one of the great heroes of the Angolan Wars, General Ochoa, to a televised national trial. And it lasted weeks in the summer of 1989. It was utterly transformative of the consciousness of many, many loyal revolutionaries who will tell you about it today, and who live in the island, as well as many who left. But it was shocking because this was a kind of Stalinist trial. Raul Castro was the judge, and at one point when he initiated the trial, he used the words, "Fidel is our father, the father of all revolutionaries." And it struck, because yes, it had been said before, but it had been said sort of in particular moments, 1975, the inauguration of the 1975 Cuban Communist Constitution, but it wasn't said by Raul Castro then. And to call Fidel the father of the revolution, and then to do that in a context in which one of the great heroes of the internationalist struggle, that which was to liberate an African nation from its colonial oppressors and its contemporary white supremacist oppressors, that man would be accused and then shot, executed. They had to change the law so they could execute him and several others. So this moment, this painting comes on the heels of one of the revolution's most important pivots. And it was a revelation for Cubans. So here you also have revelation. You have somebody who is looking at the circus from underneath the circus tent. Who is that? Is that the citizenry? Is that the United States? Is it a Goliath? Who is that? Is that God? Is it history? Do you see the big eyes? They're almost childlike. So there's so much in this painting that requires the viewer to participate. And this is why I think that Cubans never got tired of looking at Pedro Pablo, and they never get tired of looking at Pedro Pablo Oliva's paintings, because they speak so much to the need of the viewer, of the Cuban in particular, to an invitation to feel your power over your history, over your memory, over your identity, despite it all. So thank you very much for your attention.
Buenas tardes. Buenas tardes. I'm Raúl Villarreal. First of all, I want to really just thank people who invited me to be a part of this panel and be among such distinguished panelists, and also to be able to talk about the work of such an incredible maestro like Señor Oliva. You know, in the beginning, I thought, what an ambitious endeavor to have a panel where you're going to give a microphone to 4 Cubans and expect them to talk for 10 minutes. So, good luck with that from now on, right? But anyway, you know, well, I was given kind of a note that basically to address what I learned about art and how visiting Cuba has identified my identity. I left Cuba in 1972. I was 7 years old, and the first time I went back to the island was 1982, which was 10 years after I left. And I really started being exposed to Cuban art in the 1980s as an undergraduate student. I was looking at the work, especially at that time in the 80s, the Mariel boat lift had happened. And one of the reasons that I chose this work, actually many reasons why, is because it talks about los balseros, and also about the Mariel boat lift, but also because I do like beer. And as you can see, you know, they used to use a beer can almost as a boat. But being in the 1980s, growing up in Union City, New Jersey, as a matter of fact, I just found out that my panelist to my left here also lived in Union City, New Jersey. And for those of you who do not know about Union City, New Jersey, it used to be known as Havana on the Hudson, because the second largest group of Cuban exiles, only Miami would be greater. But so we had this incredible talent coming into New York City and New Jersey from the Mariel boat lift, artists, writers, poets, and I started meeting a lot of these artists and looking at their work and going to the galleries and experiencing their perspective of when they left, they left Cuba and what they had lived through. As a Cuban American, I was looking to the island from my perspective in Union City. But then eventually I started visiting the island more and more, and I also then would meet artists of my own age. And in the 1990s, I actually started organizing exhibits of all places in Newark, New Jersey. So for 5 years, we had exhibits that were called Havana Newark. So of all places, Newark became a sister city of Havana, and artists such as Belkis Ayllón, the amazing Belkis Ayllón, Elio Rodriguez, Toriak, they were exhibiting, believe it or not, they started in Newark, New Jersey, they were exhibiting in New York City, and they were about, my own age, probably a little younger. Also, Rene Peña was among the group of artists I met. And for that experience changed really the way that I started creating artwork. Because when I went back for my master's years later in 2003, I really concentrated on my Cuban heritage. Not only as Afro-Cuban, I started looking more into the religious and spiritual aspects of what it meant to be an Afro-Cuban. Then also the family heritage. From the introduction, my family has a really strong relationship with the Ernest Hemingway family. My father was Hemingway's major domo for 20 years in Cuba, and so that's a legacy that I started really also researching in the 1990s, and eventually wrote a book. So as far as an artist, what really interests me about Cuban art on the island is the fact that the incredible ingenuity, how creative they are, And for instance, also seeing the fact that humor plays a really strong part of Cuban identity. And you can see that in this work right here. You know, just the whole story of what I said. Think about the fact that you're going to risk your life in those 90 miles of treacherous waters and travel from Cuba to Key West or you know, to the Florida Straits. That is really an incredible endeavor. Now here, Oliva takes the image appropriation of a beer can and think about the fact that perhaps, like, you know, you as a Cuban, you are drinking beer, you're having a good time, and you start to then dream and hopefully let go or forget about your everyday condition. And so you start dreaming. So here the dream, or the object that's used to get you into a dream stage, is used as also a vehicle, a forms of hopefully you're dreaming of leaving the island. So for me, that was so interesting. Also, the fact that in the 1990s, after Periodo Especial, or during the Periodo Especial, I visited my family and I could see the hardship that was going around in the island, and also how the way the Cubans communicated with each other, very secretive, because it is difficult in Cuba, it was very difficult, still it is, to be able to really say what you want to say outright. There's a lot of ways that the artists are very creative in hiding messages in the work. And we saw with the other previous paintings of Pedro Oliva, how there's this incredible layering of information, a lot of allegory, a lot of story being told. And at times, I asked myself, wow, he was getting away with this. Yes, and he was being very, very courageous. I also was very fortunate to go to China. I was invited to be part of a cultural exchange. I was there for 2 weeks creating art with Chinese artists, and I also saw how they were pushing the boundaries and trying to really get some work that was very politically, I would say, sensitive. They were working with this and really pushing the government to see how far they could get with it. And in Cuba, it's the same way. Visiting the studios of other artists, not recently, in the past 5 years, how they have very strong messages, and it's done so carefully and so, I would say, you know, that's the genius behind the work, that the way they approach it. So for me, as a Cuban American, being able to come back to the United States, I realized that I actually, you know, I'm privileged of being able to paint what I want or create what I want and not have anything binding me or holding me back. So their way of presenting the work, again, ingenious, the amazing courage of trying to be historical chroniclers of their time, and at times, you know, really they risk a lot. And for me, as an artist, I find that it's just been an amazing teaching moment. There are a couple of other things I want to talk about. Going back to the Balseros, if you remember that amazing time in the when it happened that the boat lift of all this amazing amount of coverage and the different stories that came out of the Barrio boat lift. That in itself, when the artists, those who arrived, like Carlos Alfonso, Juan Bosa, Jesus Elgas, the artists that I met in New York City, they each had a story to tell. And very different stories, but they basically had one thing in common, that they left Cuba and during this particular time, and alongside with the poets and the writers, their stories would always be a part of, what I'm trying to say, this amazing moment that as a young artist, it really impacted me. And I think hopefully, if I'm not right on the time, I think I should, 1.5 minutes. So actually, I think that's pretty much it. So I'm gonna keep it short and just thank you very much.
First of all, I'd like to thank, obviously, the organizers of the panel. I thank you very much for this opportunity. I think we're breaking a world record here today. I think Cubans will speak under 10 minutes, all four. I don't know how. I just cut out like a page and a half to make sure that happens. This presentation is a personal meditation and what I see as the importance of Pedro Pablo Oliva's work to a Latino historian interested in history and memory and the representation of icons. I will discuss my own personal experiences to demonstrate that Latinos in the U.S. have multiple identities that are transnational in nature. As a Latino historian in the United States, Pedro Pablo Oliva's work reifies my belief in the importance of and our fixation on icons. This fixation has a long history in Latin American struggles to define the nation after the icon has disappeared physically, as Professor Guerra has discussed, obviously, in her work. One needs only to walk the streets of Havana, Mexico City, or Buenos Aires to realize that monuments, busts, and graffiti, as well as other forms of symbolic language, permeate the visual field. In the United States, Latino figures like Cesar Chavez, Celia Cruz, and Tito Puente have multiple identities. On the one hand, their symbolic importance rests on their success in the United States, and on the other, they also represent the nation they no longer belong to. These figures, as well as other figures, inform transnational Latino identities, simultaneously rooted outside and inside of the U.S. Pedro Pablo Oliva's work, and this exhibit in particular, contributes to the ongoing conversations that inform transnational Latino identities in the U.S. For the last 100 years, figures like Jose Marti have become themselves a symbol of a shared Latino identity. As João Felipe Goncalves has argued in the case of Marti, these icons function much like totems do in primitive societies, and their strength as a symbol resides in the agreements and disagreements they engender. Latinos in the U.S., estranged physically from one or maybe multiple sources of identity, rely on these symbols to orient them in foreign lands. It is here that Oliva's work contributes to a rethinking of transnational conversations about what it means to be a Latino here in the U.S. Oliva depicts symbols and icons like Marti and Fidel, extinct from the material world, but alive in the memories and histories of all those who claim ties to Cuba. His work on Marti, like that of Fidel, decenters and demystifies traditional portrayals of Cuban icons by subjecting them to the effects of biology. His portrayals of Marti as a father-like, somber, and pensive poet capture not the larger-than-life figure remembered by several generations of Cubans after his death, but the sensitive thinker who meditates about the turbulent history of the region. Like Marti, Fidel Castro has become another ubiquitous figure who is seemingly everywhere and whose symbolic importance extends beyond the island for the past 60 years. Unlike Marti, who is usually represented by vivid colors, the image of Fidel, as well as the image Abuelo probándose un par de alas, depict Fidel with worn-out clothing. Oliva's work ignores the myriad of images of a young Fidel Castro who led the charge against neocolonialism, and instead depicts him as human and subject to the laws of nature. Unlike the eternally young and combative communist images of Vladimir Lenin and Che Guevara at the height of their power, Oliva's work underscores the tail end of Fidel Castro's reign as leader of the Cuban Revolution. Like the extinct Manhuari, right there on his shoulder. Pictured above on Fidel Castro's shoulder, the Cuban leader is presented in the garb of an aging retiree, forcing the spectator to grapple with the permanence of what once was the youngest revolution. Moreover, it provokes difficult questions about the ultimate legacy of his project. His work spurs debate that reaffirms their strength as symbols, but also elicits questions about their legacy. Are Martí and Fidel, with their long fingers and less than heroic postures, like the Manhuari, a relic of the past, or will they transcend time and space to inspire future generations? Will Fidel Castro's importance fade, as the image suggests, or will subsequent generations of Cuba's leaders repurpose his likeness, as other revolutionary leaders in places like Mexico have, to remind citizens that the project continues despite the physical disappearance of the leader? Only time will tell, but Oliva's work provokes these questions, and herein lies what I see as the importance of his work. Before I go, my coterráneo mentioned, which I think is very important, is that this cuts across political divides. In a sense, Spanish filmmakers during Francisco Franco's reign also used these symbolic images, which can be interpreted in multiple ways in order to convey messages of liberation and anti-dictatorship. So what we're dealing with here is something that Iberoamerica has used for generations now to free itself from militaristic regimes. So thank you very much. I told you I'd keep it under 10 minutes.
I think that, would you like me to moderate? Are you going to do it?
Sure. If there are questions from the audience, I can take one.
Share.
Those of us from America are always about freedom of expression. Several of you mentioned that the expressions that we're seeing, particularly of Oliva, have hidden messages and subverted messages and interpretations. And I'm wondering if you think that the paranoia or the overwhelming concern about what might be acceptable and what might not be acceptable added to the actual creativity of the pieces.
Well, I think first of all, the one way to understand the extremes to which creative expression can be, extremes to which creative expression was contained and managed in Cuba, we often use the word repressed. But in fact, one of the reasons that the state was so successful in containing and restraining was that its approach, or the leadership's approach, particularly the party's approach, was effectively to create and also recognize that for the first 30 years of Cuba's revolution, you had a very aggressive United States, and you had a scenario that within the government was articulated as patriot versus traitor. And you could not be neutral in Cuba, politically neutral. Neutralidad was a political crime. And so the definition of what was loyalty was not abstract. It was laid out on paper, and it was enforced. And so, you know, this has repercussion in the artistic world. To not be long-winded about it, it's very quick. In 1968, Raúl Castro created a spectrum of political crimes that he labeled diversionismo ideológico, ideological diversionism. And that included doubt, for instance. To doubt, right, the legitimacy of the revolution, or to doubt the direction of the revolution, to question in ways that one thought might be Marxist but weren't actually Marxist. That was also a version of ideological diversionism. Homosexualism was a version, over-intellectualism, pseudo-intellectualism. So these categories were laid out on paper, but you also get to the point, right, that it seems like there's also an arbitrariness to each one of those categories. So that's why the constraints within which creative voices could emerge were particularly difficult to first determine, and second, to navigate. And so what happened, from 1968 to about 1984, you had a period of intense policing and surveillance of positions that were considered contrary to the positions taken by the Communist Party or to imagery that was associated with this particular version of diversionism from the communist line. And that resulted in pretty bad things. There were a lot of people who were, deprived of not just their jobs, but their freedom. The official version of, or official labeling of this process would be often rehabilitation, political education, but you were free to agree, effectively. So it's in the artistic world, in film and in art, where you get rejections of the idea that a spectrum of Marxisms even, or a spectrum of ideas about anything, is somehow counter-revolutionary. There's a questioning of that. But there's also all kinds of codes that could be used and could be created in that context. And so undoubtedly, and also humor is a very important element, as several people said, in Pedro Pablo's work, but also in the work of many other artists, because humor disarms you. You're disarmed. And often, some of the paintings that Americans find to be the most complex, Cubans think are hilarious. Like, Saturno jugando con sus hijos is hilarious. It's a funny painting, right? Because Saturno, of course, he's Cuban. Instead of like eating them right away, like, he should be doing, he's like playing with them, right? And there's a darkness to the humor too, which is also itself pretty funny. So there's humor. It becomes a political weapon that becomes very difficult to grapple with. And so yes, my long-winded answer to that is that does this context generate an extraordinary array of critique that wouldn't be there if it weren't for the nature of that context? Yes, it does. And it's because there is an imprecision to the precision that allows for that to happen.
Well, just to, in a way, complement what she has said, which is brilliant and very clearly describes the situation. You have an expression: if there is a will, there is a way. So this is the way. As she has, Professor Lineker has stated before, there's always the need to define yourself, to position yourself with respect to what the government is saying, what the accepted version of things are. And so art is more than speaking out, create ways to make people question those definitions. And of course, trying to answer your question, has this impacted the way artworks are created? Of course. In the sense that the Cuban artists have had to use, let's say, figures of speech, metaphors, allegories, to circumvent supervision of speech, and in the end, speak about the things, which is intellectually challenging. It demands from the viewer to stand in front of these artworks and start asking questions to these artworks. Because the meaning is certainly beneath layers and layers of conceptual ideas which you have to unravel. You have to unravel what is hidden beneath them. And but I think that despite the context, despite the situation, this is one of the things that has made Cuban art so interesting for so many people. Because it's not pamphleteering. It's not just speaking the truth and being against oppression just per se and, waving the banner. It also challenged you as a human being to think to actually get the gist of it, to go deeper into it, to understand its structure. Because these works of art are made with the very same structure as censorship is. So that's what I think has impacted artistic creation in Cuba. So you can't help saying what you feel. You need to express that. But if you want to put this artwork in a public space, and you want people to dialogue with it, you have to come up with ways to actually get away with it. And in the end, it's been far better. People may not leave the gallery saying, now I understand. Eureka, I got it. But I can assure you that something inside their heads have changed forever. And so also it not protects, but in a way allows artists to escape the zeal of censors. Because of ambiguity, because of ambivalence. And do you imagine something more subversive, corrosive than ambivalence and ambiguity? In a context where everything has to be crystal clear, you have to be defined, you have to... So asking the right questions and making people ask those questions is as subversive as waving the banner and putting yourself in front of the firing squad. That's the way we have found.
Just from a personal experience, just even as far as family conversations in Cuba, they became very, very creative. I remember in the 1990s speaking to my cousins, and all of a sudden, when they wouldn't mention the name Fidel, so they look around and they would go, Mickey Mouse or Lancaster. So, and they would just come up with these names, but they would do the gesture because for them, they had to basically, as they're telling the story, just be careful to make sure they wouldn't get in trouble. So even the everyday, the normal person would be creative, even when they were telling you, something.
Or we have to add this. Papa Truco was one of his names. Santa Claus. Papa Truco means like the tricky daddy, and Santa Claus was another one.
You know who.
Or yeah,
who
who you know who, right? And then there's the gesture for the epaulets for the top brass. We could go on and on.
Patricia.
There's a wealth of ways of avoiding. It's like calling the name of God. You don't mention, but you know who it is.
I will say this. I think it's important to mention too that it's not just in Cuban society that art is very threatening. I mean, in the United States, relating to mention the United States, you had the Hollywood 10, which were blacklisted in this country. You had McCarthyism. So you have the idea is that there are creative people who don't have boundaries and want to express themselves. Their states are constantly trying to silence them. And so...
I have to add something here.
Yeah.
I have to add something here. There's a difference. In Cuba, as of 1984, if you criticized or denounced Fidel Castro or any one of the top leadership in public, you get an automatic 2-year sentence. And so that's important because in fact, the 1975 Constitution that I mentioned earlier, for the first time in the revolution, inscribed it as law that the only citizens allowed with the right to criticize were members of the party, and the members of the party had the right to criticize any member of the party, including the leadership of the party. So who does that leave out? In 1975, the party membership represented 1% of the population. In 1991, that had expanded, but not wildly, to 10% of the population. So there you have specific laws that criminalize your right to criticize Fidel Castro or Raul Castro or any members of the Council of State, but you also don't have the right as a citizen to criticize, anybody, right? So I think this is why the question of how does what is the role of this extraordinary work, that puts Fidel there? That's incredibly bold. And it also speaks to the power of decades of Cubans doing this, that the state has had to tolerate overt violations of its own laws. Now, this is not a verbal denunciation, But I would argue that it's much more powerful than that because it lives on. You say something, you say abajo fide once, and you said it once. But if you say something more complex over fide, which is far beyond abajo fide, this is much more complex. This is talking about what the little fide inside of us, masks, we're part of some circus. You know, I mean, what are we doing building these tunnels because we're going to be bombed in the 1990s by the United States? What is this, Vietnam? I mean, that's the other thing. People started calling him Ho Chi Minh in the 1990s because they had to build the tunnels. You know, and meanwhile, the buildings are collapsing. You know, I mean, there were 11,000 buildings per month that were collapsing from 1991 to 1999 in Havana alone. And what are we using our cement for? We're building bomb shelters from the United States in a period of détente with the Soviet Union. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that on the ground in Cuba, people are living and having to grapple with. And so, you know, that we don't hear about that. We never even think about that. And the artist's job was often to chronicle, as you said, exactly this, and to make it permanent, to make it part of the conversation when it was never supposed to be in Cuba, and it never was outside of Cuba. I bet we could take another question.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful panel. I feel it incumbent to share a note of caution, which would not be surprising to any one of you or many people inside there, in terms of just how deep the surrealist roots of Cuban art go in general across all boundaries, across literature. I come from a post-colonial Caribbean studies background, and I'm thinking of people like Alejo Carpentier and that deep surrealism that has always been a part of the Cuban artistic tradition. But I'm just curious, listening to how you guys reaffirming all of this, just how, because I'm thinking of there have been delegations of the Soviets who came over and saw the kind of very surrealistic art at the height of Soviet realism and were kind of critical about it. And the Cubans were like, even the Cuban officials, who obviously are ideologically aligned, said, well, this is part of who we are. We have this long tradition of surrealist art. So I'm wondering, you know, as scholars and academics, what were some of the reasons? Was it just a matter of Cuban national pride that there had been this long tradition of surrealism that it hasn't been as clamped down on as much as it could have been, as happened in some other more other regimes around the world where realism became the dominant mode? But it seems to me that surrealism was allowed to flourish in Cuba, especially in painting like this. So what do you guys attribute this to? That decades still continuing and it still continues in the country.
Well,
We have like an order.
would you like to?
No.
I mean, I would rather hear from you personally, but I mean, I would say that certainly surrealism is there because the history is also surreal. And so, you know, I mean, in the 1940s, there was a guy named Eddie Chivas, who was then considered to be quite the speaker, and he had a radio show on every Sunday. Fidel Castro was his protege, and Fidel Castro imitated his way of speaking. Eddie Chivas was potentially the most popular figure to ever have emerged in Cuban politics, and you know, could hear a pin drop across the country when he had this radio show at 7 o'clock at night on Sundays. And, you know, fast forward 2 decades and you've got Fidel Castro doing the same thing, you know, and so there's a surrealness to this, especially because Cubans, again, are, I think, very committed to their history, and especially, and again, like it's not new that we don't have a lot of the official history, or the unofficial history, what people lived in the official versions. So that then transcends into the artistic world. And I do think there's also connection to literature that you mentioned yourself. The realism, and this I think maybe, David, you would want to speak to, but there's also a rejection of realism precisely because it was very opposed during the Soviet period of great influence. And, you know, abstract art, which was ironically now we know, it was condemned by the Soviet Union, considered to be a CIA invention. But when whether the CIA invented it or not, the CIA promoted abstract art in the 60s precisely because the Soviets were promoting realism. And so you have this, the two big powers of the world, neither of whom had any experts in art, deciding what was good and what was bad, right? Playing this role. And so the artist then has to respond. And I think there was a period where if you were an abstract painter in the 60s, you were out of luck. And some of them, like Raúl Martínez, became iconic of this kind of pop version of a realistic art, right? That spoke more to Andy Warhol than ever spoke to Marx or Lenin or these Russian versions of realism. But so there's, beyond surrealism, there are also kind of a whole spectrum of genres that Cuban artists began to participate in and to contribute to, precisely, again, because we are, as members of society, if we consider ourselves Cuban or from a colonial world, the colonial world of the Caribbean, we're constantly subject to these empires. And we are in dialogue with them, whether they want to be in dialogue with us or not. So I see surrealism as part of that post-colonial, or rather the anti-colonial movement of the 20th century that takes all of these different forms: cultural, artistic, literary, political.
Well, in my opinion, first let's state a fact. Surrealism as such was to be found much more in the context of Cuban culture, in literature, for instance, that it has ever been found in painting as such. Actually, as far as I'm concerned, there are very little examples of surrealism in Cuban painting. And Oliva, for sure, he kind of touches the thesis of surrealism, but he's not a surrealist artist at all. Quite the contrary, he's a realist, not a naturalistic painter, but a realist in the sense that his approach to reality is documental, if you will. Now, this said, yes, there is some kind of surreal aspect to the life and culture of our countries that probably is the fact that this spiritual umbilical cord that connects us to our ancestors and their magic thinking is still there. We're all kind of behind in that sense. Europeans, Americans tend to think that we are surreal. Maybe we just have a different kind of logic, but that's to be debated. Now, there's also this tradition of the surreal, which we don't call surreal, but magic. For instance, magic realism in Latin American culture that is always there. And as Professor Lina Guerra has pointed out, eventually it became also, not because of political agendas in the countries of the Cold War, like in the case of probably abstract expressionism in America versus realism, socialist realism in the Soviet Union, but as a kind of popular, vernacular cultural resistance from within the ranks of the Cuban culture itself against the imposition of these patterns, these new canons that came imported from a country which was far away and had a different cultural upbringing. Let's call it like this. I'm sorry, my English is not... I still live in the island, so I'm still surreal in a way. And of course, in that, the revolution as such didn't come from a socialist, culture reference. In fact, the socialist party and the communists had little, if any, real participation in the Cuban Revolution. It was a Republican liberal revolution that was rooted in the need of a very young country. It was founded in 1902, a very short history, to start building up its own identity. And actually the main sources of identity, a political, social, cultural, and constitutional identity of that country actually came from the United States, most of all, and Spain. And so in a way, after the triumph of the revolution, now I'm getting into history, which is not my major here, I think that a large portion of the revolutionary intellectuals, which were the bourgeois intellectuals actually, they were a group of intellectuals of, let's say, a transitional moment between the republic and the new establishment. And they were actually instrumental in not letting this happen. Like, this is like a strange substance that is getting into our body, and we have to reject this. We have to refer to our foundational fathers, to our foundational literature, to José Martí, to Jorge Mañach, to Alejo Carpentier. This is foreign, and only through the imposition of educational platforms, the imposition of propaganda, the imposition of censorship, part of this method of social realism might have been there in some moment, but it didn't. It was not fruitful. It didn't root it.
It didn't flourish.
It didn't flourish, right? I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Question for Pablo Oliva.
I was just going to say a couple of things. There was a Cuban painter who was very influenced by surrealism, who was Freudon.
Oh, yeah.
Forget that, okay? And had direct contact with Breton and the European surrealists. But the key aspects of surrealism that were considered politically dangerous and suspect in Cuba have to do with sexuality and exploration of sexuality, the unconscious, and expressionist painting style. And in that regard, Antonia Diz and Humberto Peña are exemplary cases of Cuban artists during the first decades of the revolution who were censored and repressed and suppressed and denied access to materials and to exhibition spaces because of Diz's expressionist painting style and Peña's focus on sexuality. There are others as well. On top of that, there was a period in which socialist realism was imposed as a mandate by the Cuban government, and that was during the Quinquenio Gris, and that produced the celebrity of painters like Nelson Dominguez, who was obeying the mandate and painting, cane cutters and celebrating the rural proletariat. That style of work was then upended by the 80s generation that refused to continue to adhere to the mandate. But the mandate was there. There were art historians and critics who imposed it, and there was policy to enforce it. So I think we have to just kind of, be clear about what happened in the art scene. It wasn't all open, and it wasn't just about the reality of surrealism in life. There was also an attempt to politically control certain aesthetic styles.
Well, thanks for the clarification, and thanks for being here. I'm honored to share this space with Corpo Fusco. And indeed, it's true. I mean, we can count Wilfredo Lam in for sure. Even though, if you go to the original thesis of surrealism, in a way, Lam is an exception within surrealism itself, because his art was also rooted in a cultural tradition which was foreign to surrealism as such, as an artistic theory. We all know it goes deeper into the subconscious and in the expression of individuality that is not pattern, is not organized by logic, but there was some kind of cultural investigation in the case of Wilfredo Lam that even though his relationship with Breton and the other surrealists place him in time, in context, and artistically within surrealism, then it was also a case of study of surrealism, but not, in my personal opinion, a surrealist as such. And in the case of Antonia Diz, of course, and Humberto Peña, but we could also mention Fonticella, we could also mention Angela Costa León, for instance. They were more identified like expressionists, more than surrealists. But yeah.
I'm just saying that there are strains that are derived from surrealist investigation.
Exactly.
By the 60s, there are no more surrealists.
Exactly.
But nonetheless, the same energy that work, and they were punished for that.
Exactly. And I believe that they were punished above all because they didn't want to comply with the new rules, which were not specifically about one artistic trend or movement or aesthetics, but about the fact that everything that came from the past was, was infected in a way, was contaminated with all the flaws of the past society. It was bourgeois, it was commercial, it was, what's the English word for it? Evasive. In a moment where only optimism was called upon, reflecting a new kind of reality. Art was needed as a tool for building up a new sense of belonging, a new sense of reality, a new world vision, to create a new man. And these artworks that were, a mirror image of artists themselves, were individual, were, subjective, were not only little understood and misunderstood by the general population, which was, the goal of the new revolutionary government and the goal of the new art as the new revolutionary government saw it. It even created a kind of counterpoint that was not only welcome, was subversive, was dangerous, And I do appreciate that you have clarified all this, because in general terms we were talking about, censorship, visibility, invisibility, the tools, the ways Cuban artists have used to actually make their way and say what they think. But we must remember there was a time when it was not simple at all. I mean, it could get you to jail. Your exhibitions were banned. Your books, like in the case of Chavo Armada, in his exhibition in 1965, they were confiscated. The exhibition was closed. And both Chavo Armada and Humberto Peña, they had to stop painting and started making book designs and posters for a living. While they continued to do their work in their houses, but they were never exhibited again until the late 90s. And so there's that. Thank you.
Being signaled.
Sorry.
I suggest that we continue these conversations out in the Galleria, in the lobby area, and want to thank our 4 panelists for joining us. Exhibition on the Pedro Pablo Oliva paintings and sculptures that are in the Harn Grandchildren Foyer, and perhaps an opportunity to meet our artist, Pedro Pablo Oliva, who will be sitting out in the Galleria, and we have 2 of his books, and he'll be available to talk to people and sign a copy if they'd like to purchase one to take home. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.